Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Bombay Chamber of Commerce and Industry, let me welcome you to the Net Zero Bharat of Fireside Chat with Sri Jayan Sinha. My name is Shruti Rathod and I will be your host today. Our chief guest, Sri Jayan Sinha, Chairperson of the Standing Committee on Finance, Parliament of India, BJP, Lok Sabha Member of Parliament from Hazaribagh, Jharkhand, has joined this session. Requesting members to post their questions in the Q&A chat box. The questions will then be compiled and asked by Ms. Anjali Bansal, Senior Vice President, Bombay Chamber, founder, Avana Capital. To begin with the proceedings, may I now invite Mr. Sudhir Kapadia, President, Bombay Chamber, and partner and National Tax Leader, Ernst & Young LLP, to deliver the welcome and introductory remarks.
Thank you, Shruti, and warm welcome, Mr. Sinha and my dear colleagues, board members, past presidents, and other participants. Thank you for joining us today evening. We were just discussing, some of you may have heard Anjali, Sri Sinha, and us, that this topic, though I must say, when we first thought about and wrote to Mr. Sinha and he kindly agreed to speak, was before the severity of the second wave of the ongoing pandemic hit us. And as it turns out, could not be more topical, could not be more relevant. And I'm sure Mr. Sinha will elucidate and explain that to us in his usual, with his usual clarity very, very soon. From my perspective, the one thing which I was thinking about earlier today is that there are some very, very important goals which this government set out as its vision for what they want to do in the country. And they were very laudable and great progress has been achieved. And it is also a measure of, maybe some lack of attention over the years in India that these basic goals, which one can call ease of living, whether it is gas connections, whether it is electricity, whether it is clean water, which were set out as priorities by the Modi government, and rightly so. And as I said, considerable progress has been achieved. And those are important, and we need to continue and finish those tasks, which is by itself not easy in a large country like ours. But as this second wave has brought home this reality to us, that whilst we do all of this, we really also need to look at the future, and this future can be very much beyond election cycles. This future can be much more sustainable than the immediacy of the firefighting we may have to do, which we are doing currently, for example, to get over the pandemic wave. Therefore, whether it is public health, whether it is education, and then the topic for today, sustainable development, environment, climate change, I don't think India has a choice now. We really need to look at these long-term sustainable objectives as well, and have a clear step plan beyond governments, beyond election cycles, to say these should be unalterable, these should be in a way inalienable, and the country and the citizens deserve to get the governments to focus on these and focus on successful implementation. So, when I was thinking about all this, I really felt that what Sri Sinha has done by way of introducing a private member bill in Parliament as recently as March 2021 on this topic of net zero emission 2050. To be very frank, only someone like Mr. Sinha could have thought about such a topic for a private member's bill. Many of us who have interacted with him will relate to what I'm saying. We need, as in every organization, we need people to execute the immediacy of things, but we also need thinkers. We need visionaries, if I may say, in every organization. And Mr. Sinha is certainly one of them for all of us, in his party surely, but for all of us as well. Because you need to see, as I said, beyond the immediate future and what steps we need to do to attain some of these long-term goals, which are also very important, by the way. And as Sri Sinha will explain, whether it is from an investment point of view, whether it is from employment point of view, and of course, whether it is from the point of view of sustainable economic development. So personally, if you ask me, I think this topic could not be more relevant, as Anjali also rightly alluded to in our in our chat just before the start of this session than it is today. Yes, the health crisis is upon us. We need to deal with that. But let us not forget that many components of this net zero Bharat emission 2050 will help us achieve not only the get over not only the health crisis, but many other goals of sustainable economic development, which India sorely needs. We all look forward to hearing your views, Mr. Sinha. And with that, Shruti, do you want to take over and then introduce? Shruti, you're on mute, Shruti.
Sorry, sir. Thank you, sir. I'm privileged to briefly introduce Sri Jayant Sinha. Sri Jayant Sinha, chairperson of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Finance, is a BJP Lok Sabha member of Parliament from Hazaribagh, Jharkhand. By virtue of winning the Lok Sabha elections in 2014 and 2019 with record margins, Mr. Sinha leads the 31-member Parliamentary Standing Committee that has oversight of the Ministries of Finance, Corporate Affairs, Statistics, and Program Implementation, and the Niti Aayog, the government planning agency. In addition, the panel has parliamentary responsibility for the Reserve Bank of India, the Securities and Exchange Board of India, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board, and the insurance and pension regulatory authorities. In the 2021 budget session, he introduced the Climate Change Net Zero Carbon Private Member Bill 2021. While serving as the Minister of State for Finance and then as the Minister of State for Civil Aviation, Mr. Sinha gained wide recognition as an innovative and result-oriented policy maker, ranging from piloting the legislation that brought in India's game-changing bankruptcy code to establishing India's sovereign wealth fund, the National Infrastructure Investment Fund, to privatizing multiple airports under an entirely new regulatory frameworks. As Aviation Minister, Mr. Sinha was instrumental in upgrading safety and security across India's fast-growing aviation system. Prior to his career in public service, Mr. Sinha was partner at Omidyar Network and the managing director of Omidyar Network India Advisors, where he led overall investment strategy and operations in India from 2009 to 2013. As a global thought leader, Mr. Sinha has been published in the Financial Times, Times of India, Economic Times, Indian Express, Business Standard, Harvard Business Review, and the McKinsey Quarterly. He has pioneered new thinking on platform-based businesses, innovation-driven entrepreneurship, climate change, and sustainable development. Mr. Sinha has an MBA with distinction from the Harvard Business School, an MS in Energy Management and Policy from the University of Pennsylvania, and a BTech with distinction from the IIT Delhi. He was awarded the Distinguished Alumni Award from IIT Delhi in 2015. It's now time for the keynote address. May I request our Honorable Chief Guest, Sri Jayant Sinha, to deliver the keynote address on getting to the green frontier.
Thank you very much, Shruti, and thank you very much to Sudhir, Anjali, and Sandeep for hosting me this evening and giving me an opportunity to speak to you about climate change. And this is, of course, a time when we as a nation are reeling from a very sort of cataclysmic corona crisis. But of course, the necessary steps are being taken in that regard. And I'm sure in the next few weeks, we shall be able to once again get back to a much more normal life and start to resume, our regular business activities and other activities that we are sorely missing right now. So I recognize that it's a very difficult time and a very trying and challenging set of circumstances that all of us are dealing with as we worry about our near and dear ones. We worry about getting them the right medical care, oxygen, ventilators, and so on. And of course, as was pointed out, I represent Hazaribagh, which is actually two districts, Hazaribagh district and Ram district in Jharkhand, about 32 lakh people. And I can assure you, I spend my entire day dealing with this emergency situation and making sure that our healthcare system and our administrative systems are up to the challenges that we find ourselves in. So it's a difficult set of circumstances, but it also at some level reminds us that the future can come and hit us very hard if we don't anticipate it and think about it carefully. And frankly, what we're dealing with right now with the corona crisis, in some ways, is actually a trailer for what might happen if we have unchecked climate change. So we're very worried, of course, about the pandemic because of the incredible impact, the terrible, tragic impact it's had around the world. But if indeed climate change progresses as people are thinking it will, then in the next 20 or 30 years, the impact is going to be even more disastrous. And so because the future catches up with us in a hurry, I think it's also time for us to begin to think about how to address climate change and other sustainability issues that are associated with the environmental challenges that we are about to see. Before I get started, I just want to give you some numbers that will give you a sense of what this climate crisis is about. Since the pre-industrial era, roughly since 1750, climate scientists have done the very detailed temperature analysis to tell us that the world has warmed by about 1.2 degrees centigrade. So since 1750 till 2021, in the last 270 years, we have increased temperatures by 1.2 degrees centigrade. This has resulted in a very different set of weather patterns and climate, even in our own lifetimes. But this is with a temperature increase of about 1.2 degrees centigrade. At current course and speed, given the rate at which carbon emissions are increasing, and of course, at which they are pumping carbon into the atmosphere, this 1.2 degrees by 2100 is going to be 3 degrees centigrade. So if in 270 years, in 7050, we've got to 1.2 degrees, the fact that we've already reached 440, 450 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere mean that in the next 80 years, under current course and speed, we're going to increase global temperatures by 1.8 degrees centigrade, an additional 1.8 degrees, so that the total temperature increases about 3 degrees centigrade. Now, there have been lots and lots of analyses as to what this would mean, but just to give you a feel for our own reality associated with this, what this basically means is that Delhi's maximum temperature go up from about 46 degrees to 52, 53 degrees centigrade. That's what's going to happen to Delhi in terms of heat, and of course the heat waves that we're going to get are going to be absolutely murderous. At the same time, most of Mumbai, by the way, is going to end up underwater if sea levels rise at the rate that people are expecting. So sometime in the next few decades, much of what is Mumbai is going to be underwater. And that's going to happen to some of our other major cities that are in coastal areas as well, because of the rise in sea levels and the rapid melting that's happening in the Arctic and the Antarctic as well. So the disruption, the human tragedy, the climate refugees, all of what is expected in the future is going to make this coronavirus pandemic, which has had $10-20 trillion of impact on global economic output, look like a picnic, to be honest. So that future is coming at us very fast. And I think one of the really sort of surprising things or astonishing things for me with respect to the pandemic is that I've gone back now, and we've all become epidemiologists in today's world. I've gone back and read, what epidemiologists were telling us 15 years ago after SARS. So SARS was in 2003. After SARS, virtually every single serious epidemiologist said that we are going to face a global pandemic. And in fact, most people believe that the coronavirus pandemic that we're dealing with is not the big one. There is a bigger pandemic that can happen. So 15, 18 years ago, virtually every single serious epidemiologist told us that this was going to happen. And with that being said, we unfortunately didn't do very much about it. And of course, as a result of that, we're dealing with the situation that we have right now. I just saw somebody on the chat say they can't hear the sound. I'm hoping you all can hear me clearly. Can you hear me all right? Sudhir and Anjali, can you hear me okay? Is that clear?
Yes,
Okay?
yes,
Right.
yes,
Yes,
absolutely.
yes, sir.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Okay, good. So what I was saying was that we as human beings are not very good at dealing with long-term challenges because while every epidemiologist told us that we are going to be facing a pandemic like this, we really did not prepare well. And so I am taking away from this pandemic the fact that we really need to prepare ourselves and be clear about what we are going to face when it comes to climate change. And that really is something that we need to start to think about today because particularly for us as investors, for example, 30 years is not a very long time. We are routinely issuing 30-year bonds, 50-year bonds. We are investing in mortgages of 30 years and so on. So 30 years is very much within our ambit in terms of our thinking as far as our sort of considerations and perspectives as investors are concerned. But even from a policy making point of view, I must tell you that 30 years is not a very long time, and we've got to start to prepare for it right now. So climate change is a very, very serious issue, not 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now. Climate change is a serious issue today. And of course, we are dealing with it with the glacial melting, for example, in Uttarakhand, the floods in Kerala, Cyclone Amphan. These things are making a difference in our lives right now. And so we've got to get ready for it. Based on all of that, I have also been thinking a lot about what it is that we can do and what the role, particularly of business, can be in this regard. And so I have put a presentation together, which I would like to share with you, that really kind of tries to pull these perspectives together. So with that, let me get to the presentation. I'll probably take 15 or 20 minutes to finish that up. And then I'm happy to take whatever questions you all might have. So with that, let me go to share screen and pull up my presentation. Okay, so I call my presentation Farm to Green Frontier, an innovation-driven development model for India that explicitly takes into account the challenges that we are facing around sustainability and climate change. Now, let me remind you all that when you talk to economists and they talk about development and they talk about how India should develop, the paradigm, the way most economists think about development is they use this term farm to factory. They use the term farm to factory. And really the way development has happened for all advanced economies, whether it is UK, France, the US, Korea, Japan, China, all of these different economies, the way it's actually happened is, people have gone from working on farms to actually working in factories. And the two vectors that have driven that are industrialization and urbanization. Now, this, of course, is a picture of China, where people have gone from working in the paddy fields to becoming, the manufacturing center for the world. So that's typically how economists think about farm to factory. Now, that is the theory, folks. The reality is that when we think about development, on the one hand, we have the planet. And with that, we mean the state of natural resources and the carrying capacity of all living beings, including viruses, by the way. So we really have to think about, how is the planet doing? And at the same time, the other axis we have to think about is people. And by that, I mean really jobs, prosperity, wealth, GDP. So that people are able to live. And then, of course, using the technology that we have at our disposal, we produce. So the curve that I'm showing here is, economists would call it the production possibility curve. And that's really balancing the planet on the one hand and people on the other hand. And with that, we produce. And that really is the way we have to think about economic growth and economic development. And it is technology which is the vector that drives this forward. this is kind of the framework that I use to talk about farm to factory and farm to frontier. Now, in that same framework, if we start to think about the farm to factory paradigm that economists use, again, as I said, the vector here that drives development is industrialization and urbanization. Again, we have the planet on the one hand, we have people on the other hand. You have folks in farms working, not able to produce very much. But when they get into a factory, they go from producing less, producing more. And that's driven because we've industrialized, we've given them better technologies so that they can produce more. We've made them living in much more urbanized areas so that they're much more densely packed together. And therefore, our ability to produce really goes up. And the theory is that as we go from farm to factory, people get more, and in some ways, the planet also becomes greener and better. That's the theory. That's what farm to factory implies when you think about it from an economist perspective. The reality, of course, as we know, is that it is quite different. Instead of the curve moving upwards and making it better in terms of both people as well as planet, the curve actually bends, the vector actually goes downwards. So while we are able to produce more for people, we are actually reducing the planet's carrying capacity. We're reducing the state of the health of the planet. And the net result of it is a series of problems that we're dealing with. Pandemic, of course, increased carbon emissions, water shortages, land scarcity, air pollution, and unfortunately, given Industry 4.0, robotics, automation, and so on, actually insufficient job creation for our people as well. So we really have a problem with jobs as well. But the reason why pandemics also happen in the farm to factory development model is because most of the pandemics are being caused by these zoonotic viruses that are going from animals to people. So the more we are hemming in animals, the more we are deforesting the planet, the more that we are making it difficult for animals to be able to live in harmony with nature, the more we are creating opportunities for viruses to move from all kinds of other animals, mammals generally, into people for which we do not have the immunity. And whether it's SARS, whether it's Ebola, whether it's MERS, or whether it's the coronavirus, these are all zoonotic viruses that are moving from animals to people, and of course, then creating these global pandemics. So we're dealing with the global pandemic, and of course, we're dealing with an immense amount of carbon that's being put out into the atmosphere because of our use of fossil fuel sources, and frankly, the amount of livestock that we have that's creating a huge methane emissions problem as well. So all of these are resulting in a lifestyle and in a development model, which while the economists say, farm to factory is the way to go, the reality is it's actually unsustainable. And this is a challenge that we are dealing with right now. Now, if we look at carbon emissions, let's try and understand really what is happening with total carbon emissions around the world and why net zero is so important. So today, the total amount of carbon that the world is putting out is about 55 billion tons of carbon. For us to be able to keep planetary warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade or 2 degrees centigrade, we have to go from 55 billion tons of carbon to about 13 or 3 if we are looking at the 1.5 degree scenario. So we are at 55 right now. We have to bring it sharply down by 2050 to somewhere close to 0. In fact, Bill Gates says it should be 0 if we want to be sure of being able to restrict warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade from pre-industrial times and get off the 3 degrees centigrade path that I was describing earlier. So we have to get down to 0. Now, to get down to 0, please understand, while most countries have committed to getting down to 0, China has said it's going to get to net zero by 2060. The US has said it's going to reduce its emissions by 50% by 2030 and really get down to net zero thereafter. India is now the largest emitter that has not committed to net zero. And even though we are doing very well with respect to our Paris Agreement commitments, the reality is as GDP grows in India, we will go from 3.5 billion tons to 13 billion tons as GDP grows, even as we are reducing carbon intensity by 2050. So if the world has to get to 0, India also has to get to 0. So we cannot have a situation where we are going to 12 or 13 billion tons of carbon and the world is coming down to 0. If we want to save the planet, then India has to get to net zero as well. That is extremely important. Now, of course, if you look at it from a climate equity and a global equity perspective, the fact is countries like the US and others have emitted way more than India has. And even if we get down to zero by 2050, we will have emitted only 274 cumulative tons of carbon, and the US would have emitted 576. And of course, GHG intensity and per capita, we are way, way below the US right now. So it's not a matter of justice or equity. Yes, it is, of course, very, very unfair what the US and other countries have done. But the reality is, if we want the planet to remain the way it is, we also have to get to zero. Now the question becomes how? How do we achieve this, and what do we do about it? And I think this question of getting to net zero is also at the same time very, very deeply linked to the question of jobs. Because the worry that people have is that if we were to get to net zero, we will not be able to develop, and we will not be able to create good jobs for our people. And this is something that I, as a politician, confront every day, because people want good jobs in India. And if I speak to Bhola Mehto, who is in Tati Jharia block in Hazaribagh district, he'll tell me he doesn't want an informal job. He wants a job either in the government if he's in the north, or if he's thinking of the south, he wants a job in IT services. So even as we are bringing our emissions down to zero, we have to create jobs for Bhola Mehto. And the reality is right now, we are not creating jobs fast enough. Right now, we have about 80 million people in formal jobs, which about 25 million are in the government, 60 million are in the commercial sector. We have about 900 million people of working age right now, but the vast majority, 80%, are in the informal sector. And about 200, 250 million people are going to be joining the workforce in the next 15 to 20 years. So we have a huge, huge problem of job creation, even as we get down to net zero, even as we head towards sustainability. Now, what should we do under the circumstances? Should we say to Bhola Mehto, okay, you're making 7,000 rupees a month in the farm. Let's give you a factory-like job by becoming an auto rickshaw driver and make 15,000 rupees a month? Should we give him a factory job, a brown job that is actually on this current unsustainable trajectory? I don't think that is the answer. It's only going to create even bigger problems. We have to find a development trajectory. We have to find a development path which is not farm to factory. It has to be different. We cannot follow the development model that the rest of the world has followed. For Bhola Mehto, we cannot give him a factory job because that's just going to crash the planet. We need to give Bhola Mehto not a brown job making 15,000 rupees a month. We have to give Bhola Mehto a green job, not a brown job. And we need to make sure that he can make 50,000 rupees a month in that, and perhaps stay in Tati Jharia and not have to come to Ranchi and be an auto rickshaw driver. So how do we create these jobs? Well, what if Bhola Mehto could become an Ola or an Uber driver driving an electric vehicle, using a smartphone, both for dispatch as well as for payments? So if we can create these innovation-driven industries, if we can create these innovation-driven businesses, then not only are we going to reduce emissions, we are also going to create good jobs for Bhola Mehto. And that's really my whole sort of development framework. I'm saying if we want the planet to get better, if we want people to be able to get jobs, we need to create these better net zero pathways where we can actually get zero emissions, get high job creation, get sustainable urbanization, and robust economic growth. So the development model that we need to create for India is one that's on a net zero pathway. And instead of going from farm to factory, I say that we should go from farm to the green frontier, where we have outstanding companies that can create these kinds of net zero jobs. And the way we do that is through continuous innovation. Rather than putting Bhola Mehto in an auto rickshaw, let's put Bhola Mehto in an electric vehicle and give him the advanced systems so that he can earn a better living for himself. The only way we can do that is through continuous innovation, by leapfrogging the technology and the innovation of the factory era, going directly to the frontier era, going to the most efficient, most innovative, most sustainable companies that are being done. Now, of course, even as we are doing this, please understand that these kinds of companies and industries that we're talking about are really going to be good when it comes to India's sustainable development goals. On the left, you can see a whole range of new industries that we have to develop and create, which will be creating net zero jobs and putting India on the net zero pathway, the sustainable pathway. And it's this set of competitive, sustainable, and resilient industries that is what we need to do. These are the industries that are innovative. These are the industries that will create these green jobs. And there's a whole host of them. There's a bunch of companies, Ether, Milk Mantra, Paytm, Indigo, LimeRoad, that are creating these kinds of jobs. Ola is a really good example of that. Ola naturally, of course, is creating jobs for people that are in today's petrol cars. But as you know, it's building the largest two-wheeler factory in Tamil Nadu, which is going to produce electric two-wheelers. It's creating a charging network that will enable a hypercharging network that will enable us to charge these two-wheelers, and it's going to create thousands and thousands of jobs. So Ola is an example of a company that is a green frontier company. It's a green frontier industry that can create these green jobs. And if we can create these direct frontier jobs, as I said earlier, the total number of formal jobs right now is somewhere about 75 million. And of those, about 10 million are these direct frontier green jobs. If we can triple that, if we can go from 10 million to 40 million of these jobs, then we can also create a whole host of additional indirect jobs that are linked to these green jobs as well. And then really we can put India on this development trajectory, bringing down carbon emissions on the one hand and creating high quality jobs where people can earn more. That really has to be our development trajectory. Now, obviously, government has a very important role to play here. Government has to build a market ecosystem that can enable these kinds of industries to grow. When I was in the aviation ministry, I did a lot of work with drones, for example, where we tried to create a market ecosystem that could take this S-shaped market development that you have to create for these new industries and really jumpstart it by putting in place standards, protocols, rules, regulations that enable the jumpstarting of these green frontier industries. And that's the role that government has to play, a facilitative role to jumpstart these green frontier industries. Now, to support that, I think it's very important to really make sure that that innovation happens, that we create this idea of a net zero Bharat. And for that, I think a net zero target is something that we should highlight, because by creating those kinds of targets, we really spur innovation, we drive investment, we make it very, very clear that as far as our policy is concerned, we are going to drive to net zero. And when we do that, we are going to create the jobs, we are going to create the investment that will enable us to get down to net zero. So then the private member bill that I have on the net zero approach is one that's modeled after the law in New Zealand. There's a net zero target that is enshrined in the law, and it's a legally binding commitment that we make domestically. But obviously, it gives us quite a bit of an ability to attract global investment. And there is a whole institutional architecture. We should create a climate change commission like the Finance Commission, and that actually then goes through and creates these net zero targets for states and industries, etc. And I believe that by creating this kind of a legal commitment to net zero, we are going to attract a massive amount of investment. And it's that investment in green jobs that can actually drive our development. So it's not a situation where it's a win-lose, where if we say we're going to go to zero, that we are going to actually lose jobs, lose investment. In fact, it's a win-win, because when we commit to this, we are going to attract a lot of investment, and that's going to drive growth. So I think rather than it being anti-growth, a net zero target is actually pro-growth. It's going to help us create a very competitive, very sustainable economy. And that's really the development model that I am suggesting, which is that instead of going from farm to factory, let's go from farm to the green frontier. Let's take Bhola Mehto making 7,000 rupees a month. Let's put him in an Ola cab making 50,000 rupees a month. Or alternatively, let's plug him into a world-class dairy ecosystem where, for example, he can become a dairy farmer with the right technology, so that he can, with 10 cows, 15 cows, start to make 50,000 rupees a month. But then you have to plug him into that dairy ecosystem. And it's not just about Bhola Mehto. It's also about Geeta Oraon in Patratu block in Ramgarh district in my constituency. If we can take Geeta Oraon and we can plug her into a world-class supply chain so that she can make custom dresses with a sewing robot, she can increase her income from 7,000 rupees a month to 50,000 rupees a month. So whether it's Bhola Mehto or Geeta Oraon, let's give them the technology, let's give them the innovation so that they can do these very high productivity type activities, make a lot more money, but also take us towards sustainability, take us to the green frontier. And I'll conclude, friends, by saying that an Atmanirbhar Bharat, to the best of my thinking, an Atmanirbhar Bharat is a Bharat that's at the green frontier. Because when we are at the green frontier, we are both highly competitive and at the same time highly sustainable. And as we become highly competitive and highly sustainable, we also become very, very resilient as an economy and as a society. And so my equation is A and B, Atmanirbhar Bharat, A and B equals CSR. Atmanirbhar Bharat is a competitive, sustainable, resilient Bharat. It's a Bharat that is at the green frontier. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions.
Thank you, sir, for a very insightful address. May I request Ms. Anjali Bansal, Senior Vice President, Bombay Chamber, to moderate the Q&A section and to propose the vote of thanks.
I have absolutely the best possible role here today, although it is always a very difficult task to come after Sri Sinha. But fortunately, I am actually also armed with some very good questions from my Bombay Chamber colleagues. Before I go to questions, I just want to read out some of the commentary that has come forth. Very nice presentation, sir. Very informative. A lot of information as well as insight around what needs to be done to actually achieve the green frontier. So I will, there are some questions that have come in, but let me start with one of my own. Sir, you mentioned the journey from farm to green frontier. And I think that is exactly the way to go. You know, business actually has to become responsible. It cannot only be for profit, it has to be profit with purpose, and the purpose has to be holistic and about communities. But to get, whether it is Bhola Mehto or Geeta Oraon, from there to an Ola job or to a job in sewing or a work in sewing, how do you think about sort of livelihood creation and skilling that will provide these linkages to get them from here to there? And secondly, linkages that will take the jobs to the people versus the people to the jobs.
No, that's Anjali, that's exactly right. And thank you for your kind comments. That's exactly right. We have to take the technology, we have to take the supply chain to people where they are. If we ask them to keep coming into our large cities, which are already at the verge of collapse, right? Not only is that going to create a series of problems in our urban mega centers, but it is also deeply unsatisfying for them. They'd rather stay with their families embedded in the social fabric than come and live in a slum in Delhi or Mumbai. So can we keep them in Patratu? Can we keep them in Tati Jharia? Those are exactly the objectives that we should be working on. And the answer is we can. Because today with the networks that we have, today with the technologies that we have, today with the cloud computing that we have, we can actually take Bhola, and instead of him being an auto rickshaw driver in Ranchi, we can say to Bhola, we will set up for you a financing mechanism so that you get an electric vehicle in Tati Jharia. And from Tati Jharia and around Tati Jharia, which by the way is about 20 kilometers from Hazaribagh, you can take people from there to the railway station in Ramgarh town. You can take people to the airport in Ranchi. And that entire dispatch will be done electronically on your 4G phone. And the payment will be done through people's bank accounts and again, completely cashless. And we will provide you the financing for your electric vehicle. And, you know, as suppose I collect, 500 rupees for a ride, from that 500 rupees, automatically 50 rupees will be taken, let's say, for financing his electric vehicle. So this whole system can be put together and he can live where he is in Tati Jharia. And, because of the supply chain, because of this very innovative ecosystem that we can put together, he can earn a much better living for himself. And that's with an electric vehicle. The same thing can be done with in dairy as well. Instead of him producing, from 2 cows, 10 liters a day of milk for 35 rupees, and that milk being sold as milk, just going to Hazaribagh and selling it there, What if there was a world-class food processing plant that his milk could be picked up, taken to the chilling center, it would come to a food processing plant. In the food processing plant, his milk, instead of just being sold as pouch milk, for example, at 45 rupees a liter, becomes ice cream that is sold at 90 rupees a liter, or it becomes a flavored lassi that is sold in Mumbai in a Tetra Pak to you at 80 or 90 rupees a liter. But we need to put in place these supply chains, these value chains, where the effort and labor of people, where it is, can become much more valuable because we've equipped them with the tools and the technologies that really increase the quality and the value of their production. Now, the beauty of all of this, Anjali, is that if we can give them those smartphones, if we can give them those systems, if we can give them AI-based learning and so on, we leapfrog them using technology so that they start to produce more. And once they are there and they're plugged into these technology-driven systems, then in situ, which is where they are, we can actually start to over time improve their skills as well, right? And that is being done not through a person, because that's very difficult. That's being done through an AI-based learning management system that's on their smartphone, and at the right time is teaching them something or the other. So suppose Bhola Mehto was just basically, driving people to the railway station. Well, now we teach him how to get to Ranchi airport, and now he's taking a much longer ride and making a lot more money in it. Or if he's a dairy farmer, we provide him information as to how he can finance 2 more cows and how he can artificially inseminate his cows so that he can produce more milk. All of that can come to him as he's doing his work. And we know exactly how to build these systems and work with companies to be able to do that. So it can be done. It is simply a matter of imagination and funding so that we can find these kinds of companies that can enable the Bhola Mehtos of the world to become much, much more capable economic agents. But this is, and I will say one thing very importantly, because every time I do these presentations, everybody says, well, what about government? What about, hey, government is doing everything it can. This is not about government. This is about all of you. What are you going to do as entrepreneurs, as investors, as suppliers? And the reason why I think the net zero target is so important is because net zero is not going to be achieved by the government. The government has a role to play by saying we are going to commit to a legally binding net zero target, right? But then it is the private sector that's going to get us to net zero. It is private investment that's going to get us to net zero. And as we do that, we equip and skill our people and make them capable of being the best workforce on the planet. It's up to us as private sector people to do that.
No, absolutely, and could not agree more with you. And again, so I'll share one example here. And there are some other questions that have come in, but one example quickly, actually 2 examples, exactly the point you made. There is so much happening in our innovation economy that sometimes sitting in big industries, we don't quite see it. But the innovation economy, that is, whether it is private funded or sometimes funded even through the government startup India Seed Fund scheme, we are seeing, for example, a company called Eggos. Eggos is working exactly in that part of the country, in UP and Bihar, working with smallholder farmers and organizing the egg supply chain. And they want to create the Amul for eggs. So nothing should go wasted. The price of eggs should improve. There are supply chain efficiency, so the farmer earns more, and the consumer benefits from better nutritious protein in the eggs. So there are companies like that coming up. If I switch to a little bit on what should big industry do? So there's a question from V. Parthasarthi, our past president. If we are asking the industry a couple of things they must start, stop, and continue, what would your suggestions be?
Well, I think the answer, as I've said, is innovation, right? Because we really have to innovate. And as somebody who spent many, many years at McKinsey helping companies think about innovation and new businesses, I must say that it is difficult for large companies to innovate because of just the incentive structure that gets set up, the kind of organization that gets set up, and so on. Big companies are good at doing things in a predictable and efficient way. But innovation is much messier, it's much more difficult to do, etc. So you need a very different type of organization, very different funding and budgeting models to be able to innovate. So you have to, as a big company, you have to figure out a way in which you can both do what you have to do as a big company, but also be able to do what you have to do as a startup and as a small company. And you have to be able to walk and talk and chew gum all at the same time. So it's becoming multi-skilled as a large company to be able to innovate. But even as you're doing that, please find the disruptors. Potentially you can invest in them. Potentially you can acquire them. Potentially you can partner with them. But we really have to be out there in the world, finding those disruptors that could potentially disrupt you or transform your industry, and really try and figure out how you can replicate and take advantage of their business model. So as a large company, innovation has to be very, very important to what you do. Your people have to recognize that innovation is key, that they are empowered to innovate, etc., etc. And there are libraries full of advice on what to do as large companies. What you have to stop doing is to stop being complacent, of course, right? Because the world changes in a heartbeat, and we've already seen that with the coronavirus pandemic. And these shocks, these problems come so quickly at you that if you're not agile and if you're not sort of fast about responding, then you get into a lot of trouble very quickly. So can't be complacent. You're always, only the paranoid survive, as Andy Grove famously said. And continue is, the ways in which you make money, the way you generate cash flow, try and continue that, try and make that even more asset efficient, try and make sure that you equip your people even better. Those are the kinds of things that I would suggest.
Thank you. Question from Girish Pandey. How are we seeing investment in renewable energy creation as well as nuclear energy in the current decade or decades, which will help to reduce the GHG emissions? And India is still quite dependent on thermal energy. So, question.
That's right. But we are seeing tremendous investment going into solar and renewables generally. The government has set up a target of 450 gigawatts for renewables. We've got to about 95 gigawatts. So we definitely need to invest more. And today the cost of solar and wind, particularly in India, is below that of thermal. And so I think we are going to see increasingly more investment in renewable. And those have been profitable, good, high quality investments. And it's a great investment opportunity. In fact, don't get me wrong. I mean, I think that the green economy and the green transformation that has to happen in our economy is going to be the best investment opportunity we're going to see in our lifetimes. So I think there are incredible opportunities in renewable energy, in the electrification of our economy, in electric mobility, in greening so many of our industries, et cetera, et cetera. So renewables, along with a host of other industries that I indicated, are going to be the most incredible investment opportunity we'll ever come across.
And even things like water and waste and circular economies and things that are in that realm, which it's not clear if they're investable today, but certainly many of us believe that that's really where returns will come from,
well, Anjali, I think
financial and social.
Yeah, and I think you touch on an important question, which is investability. I think if you had seen Elon Musk's plan for Tesla back in 2003, you would have said it's not investable, right? If you had looked at Jeff Bezos's plan for Amazon back in 1992, 93, when he was just getting started, or looked at Amazon for 20 years thereafter, you would have said it's not investable. But I think the amazing thing about the innovation ecosystem in the US is that if they see a truly disruptive business model and a really outstanding entrepreneur, they back that person not with $10 million or $100 million. They back that person with $10 billion, $100 billion. And they back him to the hilt and enable companies like Amazon and Tesla to get created. And I think it's extraordinary what Bhavish Agarwal is doing with Ola, with the kind of investment he's making in production of electric two-wheelers and his hypercharging network. But those are the kinds of investments we have to be able to say, and it's not about individuals. We have to have a financial system that can back people with 10, 20, $50 billion. Now, as chairman of the Standing Committee on Finance and somebody who spent a lot of time over the last decade or so building up India's startup ecosystem and India's alternative asset management industry, I can tell you that we have come a very long way in being able to finance companies like Ola. Now, of course, the challenge is 80-90% of that is still money coming from outside India. But step by step, we are building up our domestic capability also. And all the steps that we've taken from a policy perspective to really enable the whole AIF ecosystem to take off is really starting to pay dividends now. The Zomato IPO is going to be a landmark IPO, a $5-6 billion IPO. of a company that was backed in large measure by InfoEdge, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we are now starting to build our own financing ecosystem, not at a scale of 10 or $100 million, but at the scale of billions of dollars. And the more we can do that, the more we can back our entrepreneurs like Bhavish, the more we can create these massive disruptive green businesses.
No, absolutely. In fact, alternative investments should become far more mainstream in the Indian domestic context. So all the upside from this innovation, or at least a large part of it, not just the social upside and the economic upside, but also the financial upside can be captured domestically. So our insurance companies, our pension funds, which I know is some of the work being done by the Standing Committee on Finance. I think we have time for a couple more questions. There is farmers and industry need support and ecosystem. How can this be sped up? And this will go a little bit back to what is the role of government. There has to be some role of government in enabling and facilitating, and even setting frameworks. And then, of course, something that all chambers of commerce like to talk about is ease of doing business, so that it makes it easier for the next Bhavish Agarwal or the next Abhiraj Bahl or the next Dipinder Goyal to emerge.
So as I said earlier, I do believe government has a very important role in terms of facilitating and jump-starting these ecosystems. So even if you look at the electric two-wheeler market, there's been a lot of work that Niti Aayog and others have done in the whole electric mobility ecosystem. So that's been a convening role that Niti Aayog has played in that. And at the same time, there are a number of regulations that have been brought in to enable electric mobility to happen. So those are the kinds of jump-starting steps that are necessary, facilitation steps that are necessary, which the government has, of course, been doing along the way. From a financing point of view as well, we've done a lot of work in terms of building up domestic venture capital and domestic fund of funds, etc. I mean, just on AIFs, for example, in 2015, when we really got going on it in a serious way, when I was at the Ministry of Finance, there were virtually 0 rupees in AIFs. Today, there are somewhere between 4 or 5 lakh crores in AIFs. So this is an industry that's really taken off very, very quickly. And that's the money that's now flowing into startups as well. So whether it's on the financing side or at the industry side, government has a very important facilitating and role to play. And of course, their engagement with stakeholders, speaking to stakeholders, continuously figuring out where the friction is and resolving that friction is a very important aspect of what we as a government have also done, which is why policies evolve and get better over time. Again, coming to ease of doing business, here again, there are innumerable steps that we have taken for ease of doing business. And of course, there are still many, many miles to go on that and so on. And so there, again, if people have specific pain points, please send me an email to the Standing Committee on Finance. Tell us where the pain points are, what the issues are, and we will work with the government to try and resolve those. But really, that is something that is an ongoing effort on our part to streamline and improve ease of doing business as much as possible.
Anjali, if I can just come in here.
Yes, please, Sudhir.
Mr. Sinha, we'll take your offer on this one. We have just concluded a survey for ease of doing business amongst our members. In fact, it will be in print and come out very, very quickly in the next 7 or 10 days. So we'll definitely send that to you, sir, and we'd like to engage with you. I also had one question, what you said about crossing the, or leapfrogging to the green frontier is of course ideal. But would you also say that we have the ability to also leapfrog to more sustainable manufacturing practices? Because that also gives a lot of jobs. Just as existing large companies are adopting ESG goals, SEBI has now required a lot of, disclosure from listed companies. Similarly, the new investments, the PLIs we are talking about, we can also encourage green manufacturing, sustainable manufacturing practices, so that not to give an impression that manufacturing is not after all, we are still not a developed country to ignore manufacturing completely, whilst taking steps towards the green frontier, as you mentioned. I don't know if you have any comments on that one as well.
No, Sudhir, you're absolutely right. I'm not ignoring or diminishing manufacturing at all. obviously we have to do a lot of manufacturing and we have to build up our manufacturing. All I'm saying is we can't do it the old way. We have to do it the new way, which means that the manufacturing that we do has to be very green, very efficient, very AI driven. It has to be at the frontier in terms of efficiency and technology. And so that statement of farm to factory is not to frontier is not ruling out factories, except that the factories we have should also be at the frontier. They should be net zero. And by the way, cement, steel, the aluminum, these industries really have a lot of work to do to get to net zero. The good news is they're doing it. They are committed. And in fact, our large companies are doing a super job in really thinking through what they should do to reduce their carbon emissions, to get to net zero, and are very, very environmentally responsible. So I think, kudos to our large companies because they have really played a leadership role. But again, let me take you back to the job situation that I was speaking about, right? Today, we have 900 million people in the workforce. In 20, 25 years, 30 years, we will have 1.1, 1.2 billion people in the workforce, right? There are only 60 million people in formal jobs today. So if we solve the problems of the 60 million, that's good, but really we have to solve the problems of 500 million people, 400, 500 million more people that we have to employ in a green way. So the 60 million, which are in today's big companies and so on, will, I'm sure, get their job done. I'm looking much more towards the 500 million people that we have to put into formal jobs. And we have to put them into jobs that are green jobs, that are high quality jobs, that give them good sustainable employment, while at the same time bringing down carbon emissions and pollution and so on. That's really what we have to solve for. I think the 60 million in big companies, that problem will get solved. I have total confidence in that. But what the industries of the future create, the employment of the future that we have to create, we have to make sure that's on a totally different trajectory altogether.
And Industry 4.0 will not create as many jobs as the old ways of manufacturing did, because so much of it is actually automated now and AI-led, as we mentioned earlier. So there's a question from Anirban Chatterjee. How can we set up an effective monitoring and assurance framework for Net Zero Bharat to achieve our periodic milestones along the way? And I will tag along that saying that what gets measured gets done. And already we spoke about ESG. So when capital moves, action follows. So with Larry Fink and BlackRock and the Norwegian Pension Fund and now New Zealand coming out with these very clear norms around investment, large companies have all taken note. So what used to be a subject matter for, say, the audit committee on compliance really and not falling short on any compliance has now then moved to stakeholders relationship committee, and now it's become a board matter because it's actually going to move your stock price and capital movements. So there is ESG, there's a lot of work being done on measurement for that, whether it's the UNPRI and so on. But going back to Anirban's question, what in your view, as we think about Net Zero for Bharat and the climate commission that is being talked about, what is an effective monitoring, assurance and measurement framework that we as industry in partnership with government should adopt, so we actually make the progress, the right progress towards net zero?
Well, that's a great question, Anjali. And I think there's both a top-down aspect to it and a bottoms-up aspect to it. Mm-hmm. The top-down aspect to it is what I am trying to do through the private member bill by creating a climate commission, saying that there is a net zero target for India, and then doling out a certain carbon budget for different industries, different states over time. And really then monitoring it, ensuring it, and creating penalties around it. So you have to pay a heavy fine if you don't meet your target. So that's kind of the top-down approach to doing it through a climate commission modeled after what the UK and New Zealand are doing. The bottoms-up approach to it is what Sudhir was alluding to earlier in terms of the ESG and other reporting and compliance requirements coming from SEBI. Now, I've obviously been in discussions with SEBI and RBI in terms of actually strengthening compliance standards when it comes to green reporting and so on. So we've been working, through the standing committee and in our discussions with SEBI and RBI on that as well. That, of course, many central banks are already moving towards green finance and are requiring, banks to start to assess climate risk as part of their overall risk assessment framework. So obviously those are important for RBI as well. And those are the discussions we've been having with RBI. So bottoms up, we've got to strengthen compliance company by company. And just like every company is doing its reporting on its financials, it should do its reporting on its environmental impact as well. And top down, of course, we have to legally binding target. And if everybody reports and everybody measures and everybody manages, then we can actually get there. But it really has to be in a very disciplined, thorough, long-term way, which is why I think it's very important to get started ASAP.
I'm conscious of the clock. We are 3 minutes past 7. Sri Sinha, can we take a couple more minutes?
Sure, of course we can.
Okay, great. So there's some other very interesting questions that have come in as well. Somebody asked, again, Anirban, again, I'm picking up your question. What is the future of hydrogen fuel infrastructure development in India? Do you think it will help to reduce our emission in large volume? And I know it's a pretty specific question, but it's something I'm interested in, so I've also asked.
Well, I'm not an expert, so I can hardly give any great insight here. But from the people I talk to who believe that there will be a requirement for fuels, and then hydrogen is right on top of the list when people look at green fuels, etc. So at least based on the investments that are going in and what experts are saying, this is looking like a very big and very important industry that's going to develop as far as hydrogen is concerned. And certainly it'll have a role to play along with solar and wind and everything else. Because, for example, in aviation and elsewhere, it's not going to be possible to electrify everything. And when it's not possible to electrify everything and you need fuel, then hydrogen seems like a good bet. And then, of course, a series of biofuels as well.
Oh, thank you. And final thing now, on behalf of the chamber, this chamber has a track record and a history really of being a very constructive interplay between policy and industry. And as a chamber now, we are also recognizing that chambers have to represent not just the old industries, but also the new ones. So we actually have a big thrust into the startup ecosystem and the innovation ecosystem. So what can we do to help and support you and the Climate Commission on this journey towards Net Zero Bharat? The A plus B equals to CSR.
A and B equals
What
CSR.
can we do to help? Yes.
No, I think that's fantastic, Anjali, that you all are really engaging with the startup ecosystem and really supporting them in what they're doing. And I think there is a very good bridging role that chambers can play on the policy side. Because if you're seeing whether it's in certain industries or whether you're seeing across the board for the startup ecosystem, pain points, areas where policy has to evolve, policy has to get better, capturing that and really bringing it to the attention of policymakers, whether it's through me or through others, I think it's very, very valuable. And what happens is that, I can tell you as a policymaker, that when a single company comes to you, you tend to be somewhat skeptical because you think that it's just self-interested inputs that they're providing. But when it is coming from a chamber or it's coming from an industry association, everybody signed up for it, then it's an industry issue, it's not a company issue. And then you pay a lot more attention to it. But here's one thought I would have for all chambers. Because what happens is that the chambers always come back to you with a long laundry list of things. There are some things that are literally $1 trillion impact things. And then there are some things that are just, $100 things or 1 crore things. But it's very important to separate out the 1 lakh crore bang for the buck things from the 1 crore, kind of impact. What are the 3 or 4 things that are genuinely going to move the needle, right? And that's why the chambers have to do more than just compiling and cataloging. They have to spend real think time with their members and really figure out through insight, through understanding, what are the 1 or 2 levers that are going to make all the difference? Because very often you find when you're a policymaker, simple tweak unlocks an entire industry. A simple, small tweak can do that. And some of those tweaks are things that can be done simply through a letter, through just a notification. You don't need an order, you don't need a gazette notification, you don't need any changes to the rules or let alone legislation. Because even in the policy hierarchy, as a policymaker, there's a range of tools that you can use. Those that you can do simply through a government order is very easy to do, right? So even as you're thinking about the biggest bang for the buck, also classic 2x2 matrix, where's the impact and how easy is it to do that, right? So that kind of analytical thinking, synthesizing a little bit from the membership, what is impactful and what is really easy to do just simply in terms of a government order as opposed to a legislation, that kind of analytical work can help policymakers a great deal. And that enables you to separate, things you really need to pay attention to things that, are just sort of incidental. So not a laundry list, but a good prioritized list of things that can be done. I think that can be very, very helpful.
So I think the chamber has its to-dos. And on that note, I cannot express enough thanks and appreciation. I think it's been such an educative, informative session. It's a new topic, even for us at the chamber. And so to hear it directly from you as the sponsor of the bill in Parliament, lots of food for thought, clearly a lot of action for industry to start, stop, and continue, as Partha very eloquently put it. Engagement with innovation, recognizing that there is an alternative path for development, which goes from farm to green frontier, and really getting to A and B equal to CSR. So thank you so very much again. Appreciate your taking the time and this very interactive conversation. On behalf of Bombay Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for giving
Thank you,
an opportunity, and thank you for the excellent question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.